It's hard to imagine, especially for Western soldiers, the intensity and the amount of artillery shelling that's going on.
In this video, I asked a German combat engineer and Ukraine veteran what were some of the biggest surprises for him at the front line. To which the Ukraine expert Dr. Colonel Reisner from the Austrian Armed Forces adds further commentary. Note the video was recorded on 25th November 2024, so major changes since then are of course not accounted for. So Buttjer, what was for you a major surprise?
The inconsistent dynamic, I would say. So you have totally different changes of dynamic on a battlefield, even in situation where you consider which on terrain which would be favorable for massive tank pushes. There's like staggering continuous infantry fighting over months or years. I personally think about Chassif Yar, for example, where the dynamic stopped for a long, long time. So when I remember like the beginning of 23, I was there already in rifle range to the Russians, and they didn't use the momentum to push into the city for like over a year, and which when they had all the favorable situation on their side, but then you have in situation where you don't consider it still active fightings. For example, in the past it was always told that in the winter it's pretty difficult over there, but which is not true. There's constant fight going on. The terrain is sometimes even more favorable for mobile operations in the winter than in other times of the year, and it's the dynamic is really shifting and it's unpredictable sometimes. This is for me mostly surprising in this war, and even in areas where you came already to complete stalemate, it's mostly there where the most thing happen, where's a constant work going on.
Can you elaborate on the last part? I'm a bit confused. So there was a stalemate reached, but still continuous fighting?
Yeah, there's in that areas, I think the most people have a view that there's like a trench and a minefield and then it stops everything, but the situation has to be maintained. If it's not defended properly, it's constantly contested. To check if there's a weak spot or not, there's like constant reconnaissance going on, constant drone fighting. It's like it's this what we call the daily grind going on. So it's like a static situation, but the intensity doesn't get lower.
So it's basically an operational stalemate, but on the tactical side you have constant attrition and losses and fighting going on.
Yeah, may I jump in for a second? Well, this is exactly what I always call this war of attrition, what we see actually, which is fought in Ukraine. I guess every one of you know there's a very famous movie called Im Westen nichts Neues, and the title of this movie pretty much says that for the home front there was nothing really going on actually on the west front, but in reality there was a lot going on pretty much. There was a lot of artillery shelling, there was a lot of fighting, snipers and so on and so on. Yeah? And this is also the case in Ukraine. Yeah? And it's also related, first of all, because there is this so-called transparent battlefield. That means every side can see what the other side is doing. So there is no real staging anymore and there is no real maneuver as long as you cannot control this transparent battlefield by bringing down the drones. And that means there is a constant fight, but you still think that there is not much going on, which is not true because, as it was said completely right, there is these small skirmishes going on, there is these drones fighting it against troops on the ground, there is reconnaissance going on, there is artillery shelling, rockets, mortar, and so on and so on. And this is what we see actually, that the war is grinding down more or less.
Yeah, especially the artillery shelling. So it's hard to imagine, especially for Western soldiers, the intensity and the amount of artillery shelling that's going on. It's not only when I compare it to my times in other missions when I was in the German forces working with other Western forces, artillery was mostly called in only on to destroy or to put a certain target under pressure. It was mostly a one-time event in a certain time frame, but there's artillery shelling constantly going on, and it's not randomly, it's planned, because as soon there's some quiet times on the zero line for one side or the other, this time will be used to either way to fortify better, to get some more resupplies, or to even organize your troops better. And it's like this constant harassment fire going on just to show the side that this is an area they can't use. It's not necessarily directly to destroy something or to interrupt something, but of course, yeah, it's to interrupt something, but on a longer time scale. So if you're on a zero line, it's like there's no minute without shelling. You hear somewhere every time something.
I just would like to refer to the old Soviet manuals of war fighting in the case of a hot, cold war. And as you know, and as we both know, some of these old manuals are still valid and also used by the Russians. So the Russians, for example, they know a tactic which is called to seize terrain by fire. That means constant fire on a certain terrain spot to make it possible to more or less make sure that the enemy will not attack, because this terrain feature is under constant fire of artillery shelling. And this is what you have actually described. But I want once again stress what you said. As someone who has served in Afghanistan and in the Sahel, our fear at that time was always improvised explosive devices. But there was no artillery used against the International Security Assistance Force, or later Resolute Support Mission when it was Afghanistan, or not even in Africa. And as you completely right pointed out, that was a real shock for a lot of Western soldiers who joined the International Legion when they saw actually what it means to be under constant shelling of even heavy artillery up to 152 millimeters rocket artillery, which has a devastating effect. And that was a shock. And the International Legion lost a lot of soldiers, because they were absolutely shell-shocked, I would say, and returned back from Ukraine to their home countries and said, Jesus Christ, you cannot compare that with Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, can totally underline this. It's I actually saw that firsthand. And so for a lot of Western soldiers over there was not only the artillery a shock, but also the situation that you are in a weaker situation than your opponent. Because in all these coin operations in the past, Iraq or Afghanistan, you always had the upper hand, and the most guys weren't used to work under such pressure, got low supplies, have to improvise, and so on. A lot of guys just couldn't stand that and quit it at that point. It was completely unknown for them.
Note, this is one video out of a longer talk between the two. There will be more in the future, so stay tuned. Big thank you to Dr. Colonel Reisner and Buttjer Freimann for this talk. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.